On the question of imagining a better world, we've talked a little bit about different areas of identity, how they relate to many of the union organizing efforts we've seen in recent years. Something that we've been quite interested in on the podcast is exploring this idea of what exactly Jewish workplace organizing or a Jewish working class, if we're thinking in those more rigid traditional categories, what does that mean actually in a practical sense in the 21st century around the world? I have thought about this and I can't say that I have any real experience in organizing because I don't. So it's just been a few thoughts that I've had more recently, and they apply primarily to a European context because I've never been to America. So I have to think of it like so. But I'd be very interested to hear what you think about this. Oftentimes when we think of why Jewish workers are not talked about as a category as much, I think that there are these points that are made that are potential obstacles, but then upon closer examination, I don't think that they are actually as big obstacles as originally are thought of. One is this idea that Jews are disproportionately wealthy compared to the rest of the population, which at best I think is difficult to prove, depending on who you identify as a Jewish person. There isn't really much research that takes place on this when it comes to how Jewishness is defined. And at worst, I think this plays into ideas that come quite dangerously close to perpetuating anti-Semitic stereotypes. And even if you consider the idea that maybe Jews are disproportionately wealthy to the general population or maybe other marginalized communities, even so, so-called middle-class Jews are not immune from poor workplace conditions. They feel the pressure from increased costs of living. They do feel alienation from not having control of how their workplaces are organized a lot of the time. And even if it is disproportionately smaller than the general population, a significant section of the Jewish community is a part of the working class or do work to earn a living. There's no reason to believe that a general organizing for better conditions would not benefit them, and there aren't specific ways in which Jewish workers might benefit in certain areas of organizing compared to others. And of the population, you have to also consider this is less the case in a country like the United States, although there are of course a lot of people whose Jewish identity can be questioned by more mainstream communal institutions, by the fact that they're patrilineal or they might only have one Jewish grandparent. But certainly in a lot of countries in Central and Eastern Europe, there is a certain section of the population that does have a form of Jewish ancestry, but they don't feel that they have the possibility of being engaged in the more mainstream communal institutions, partially because of the conditions. They might not have the financial resources to spend a lot of time to reconnect with their Jewish identity, or it might not be an inclusive environment for people that work certain businesses.
Or they just see Judaism solely through a religious lens, which I think is a very Christian understanding of Judaism that makes it very unappealing. A lot of people don't identify with religion, and even if they have Jewish ancestry, they're like, this part of Judaism doesn't speak to me, so I'm just not gonna even try to connect with a Jewishness that might resonate with me and who I am and where I come from.
Yes, absolutely. I think that a Jewish worker organization has not just a sort of romantic idea that it would be nice to have something like this, but as an actual practical reason to exist, a raison d'être, to use a nice French expression. We can talk about also specific union and workplace organizing on, for example, like anti-Semitism training, or just like a mutual aid society, something along the lines of what the workers' circles were originally designed when they were created. And this would allow for a certain kind of Jewish worker influence on how Jewish culture and community are structured. So I was wondering, from your perspective, in a lot of countries of Central and Eastern Europe, the idea of this is really thought of as like an abstract, a hypothetical, or something that we can't build on our own. Certainly not in the perspective of the diaspora, without a strong American presence and connections around the world. So what are your thoughts on this, and what do you think Jewish labor organizing can have on the influence of Jewish culture and communal structure?
I might also add, just before we open it up to you guys, there is, and has been historically, what's called the Jewish Labor Committee in this country. And the Jewish Labor Committee was formed in 1934, specifically as a response to the rise of Nazism in Europe. And its sphere of action was to represent Jewish communal interests in the labor movement and labor interests in the organized Jewish community. And it's been part of the AFL-CIO, it was part of the Change to Win Federation, but for the most part, it's extremely Zionist, and it's also very top-down. Like, it's within the AFL-CIO, but has anyone ever heard of active Jewish labor committee people within locals, within unions? I would be pushed to find that. It's interesting to see that there is, or historically has been, something like that. but it's very much suffering from a lot of the issues that we've raised throughout this conversation. Rank and file caucuses, for me, that's the sort of way I'm thinking about it. This could be potentially a rank and file caucus that is dispersed across the labor movement and able to perhaps even help integrate the labor movement as a cohesive movement from the grassroots.
I guess two things are coming to mind for me. So one is that I can think about this on like a personal level in terms of how my Judaism informs my labor organizing practice. And then I can also try to answer this on a broader political level. Personally, I think that raised culturally Jewish, I've pretty much always been an atheist, but as a cultural identity, Judaism has always been important to me. And I think in that sense, studying Jewish history and having a sense of Jewish values, and really in particular, I think studying like family history and Jewish history has instilled from a very young age a strong sense of justice and injustice, and also like a healthy skepticism of the US state. When I was in middle school, our last year of middle school, we had to like do a big research paper, and I wrote mine on US complicity in the Holocaust. And I think that was sort of like one of my early like moments of understanding my Jewish politics. And I guess in terms of family migration history, my family ended up in the US because my great grandfather was a communist and was fleeing under Tsarist Russia because he was hiding weapons in the basement of his synagogue, and his rabbi reported him. And so that's why he fled and how we wound up in the US. You know, very, very far from the politics I was raised in. But I think that's the family immigration story that's like sort of seeped into my politics in certain ways. Kind of building off of that and seeking a Jewish politics outside of Zionism. I think one of the things that's interesting about the question you're asking, and particularly in a US context, is that Jewish identity has been so intentionally conflated with Zionism and support for Israel that I think there are so many folks who have been indoctrinated into that, and I think cling to Israel and cling to Zionism because that's how they understand Jewish identity. And so I think having alternative ways of understanding Jewish identity is so important. For me, that was learning about Bundism, learning about Deutheit, which I also think that concept of here-ness, for anyone in the working class, you have a here at work. So thinking about that as a space where you're organizing, and as the notion of Deutheit suggests, right, doing work in solidarity with other marginalized people where you're at, that is one way to think about what labor organizing is. In the last episode, you were talking about labor organizing as this sort of beg tent thing, which I think is both one of the challenges of it and one of the aspects that's really important in it, in that there's always all sorts of fractures on the left. So you can have a group of 5 people who have all sorts of political debates internally. But I think in a more obvious way with labor organizing, you really do have to work across difference for everyone to win, right? So there's a very clear and concrete way in which to have a labor victory, you have to be willing to work with folks who might have radically different ideas than you do. And I think that is in great contrast to Zionism as a separatist logic, right? A logic that says Jews will never be accepted, and so we need to separate ourselves into our own settler nation state. I think that in anti-Zionist politics, I think there's parallels that can be made to thinking about labor organizing in terms of the necessity of working across difference to actually bring about meaningful change.
That was such a great answer. For me, part of the thing that I think about is the way that over the last 100-ish years in America, Jewishness has been assimilated more and more into whiteness. And so I think a lot of like white Jews in America have sort of lost the sense of history around like the Jewish working class. There were a lot of not just like Jewish organizing in the workplace, but also other groups that weren't seen as white, whether it's Italians, Poles. And so I think for me, being Chicana, I've seen that in like other communities as well, where people forget that their families have immigrated and have sacrificed a lot to sort of be like these aspirational roles. I know so many people who have gone into, whether it's working in like the White House or doing politics with people who have done horrible things to our neighbors and like our parents. And so I think part of it is rejecting the sense of wanting to assimilate into the broader culture, because that's not going to keep me safe. The sense of community that I have, whether it comes with fellow Jews or whether it comes with the Latinx community, those are the places that I feel safe. And like me getting a degree, me doing XYZ, working, like people I know who go to galas with like Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, great, that's like still not going to protect you. They're still going to deport our families, is the reality of it. Connecting to the broader sense of our communities and not just trying to be like, well, I got mine. And then expanding that not just to like our own communities, but to the wider labor struggle as a whole.
I guess what this made me think of was how in like the early 1900s, when we did have unions that were exclusively white, you did have like the progressive position being integration, which is often conflated with assimilation. And for Jews, which have historically been able to pass as white and been able to join whiteness, for example, Samuel Gompers, who I love to make fun of because he was a piece of shit. He was a Jewish immigrant who was born in England and then came to the US when he was relatively young. And then he became the AFL president, the president of the American Federation of Labor, for about 40 years, from the mid-1880s to the mid-1920s. And as a Jewish immigrant himself, he led the charge for Chinese exclusion. He was extremely anti-immigrant for an immigrant himself. It just shows that it's very possible for Jews to just kind of assimilate into whiteness. But I think when we think about how we might organize a movement that is still integrated, but still recognizing difference and the beauty that is in diversity, and thinking about how we might organize in a way that is still united at the grassroots, but also allows people to be united along lines of identity in a way that allows people to feel that support, and frankly, to reintegrate the labor movement beyond these different unions, locals, and even federations that are really top down. And it just reminded me of the Socialist Workers' Federation in Thessaloniki, in Greece, that was founded in the early 1900s. And it was founded largely by Jews in Thessaloniki. This was a very Jewish area. But how it was organized was as a federation of ethnic subdivisions, essentially. So you had the Jewish part, you had the Greek part, you had the Turkish part, Bulgarians as well. It was a very diverse place. It was grounded in unity as socialists. It was a political organization that was organizing workers as workers and embracing that they have diverse roots and spoke different languages. And I think for me, it's really about finding that political unity, because you did say in the labor movement, it has to be a big tent. And of course it does. You're fighting really real struggles that you need unity to win. But at the same time, you do need political unity to actually push that struggle beyond those narrow economistic aims that you can get the big tent behind. And I do think and wonder whether or not there is a position or a place for that sort of organizing within the labor movement in this country and frankly around the world. Ideally, you could have a Jewish labor association or network that unites Jews across the labor movement, across the US, but also across Europe, across the Middle East, across wherever Jews are. As socialists, as internationalists, we have to think about how we could actually build a labor movement that could actually not fail where it has always failed. The Second International, which was perhaps when the labor movement, the socialist movement, was best organized as a cohesive movement, it fractured the moment World War happened. They were unable to prevent nationalism from dividing workers and just getting them to back their governments in waging a war on people that they were just days before calling their comrades. Because of this almost cyclical history, I wonder if organizing a Jewish labor association, based in the grassroots but organized across different unions and nations, might be able to help engage with cultural particularities while transcending the political borders that can undermine solidarity. Of course, this would have to be part of a larger reorganization of the international movement for social transformation, whether through the Progressive International, as we discussed in episode 5, or through another coalitional body. Yet it must be said that a lot more thinking has to be done to explore how this might relate to other diasporic and non-diasporic communities.